As a young detective and a trainee detective, you're often cited on changes in forensic evidence. 1986 is so limited for forensic evidence at that time. They're so limited to what they would be able to have. Completely different now, and so many techniques and advantages that we have as investigators to progress it. We will never stop for any inquiry, any open unsolved murder in Scotland. We will always continually review what we have, what new technology do we have, what new techniques do we have, and also fresh set of eyes. And that will be persistent, that we try and find killers.
Greenock is actually a mixture of both high poverty and quite affluent areas. There's a bit of a mixed bag. It's quite a close-knit community. You know, most people know, everybody knows each other. So when anything significant happens, you know, you can be sure that somebody knows somebody who was, you know, involved in it.
Around 25 miles west of Glasgow, the town of Greenock sits at the mouth of the River Clyde, and in 1986 it was home to 16-year-old Elaine Doyle.
Elaine was just a typical 16-year-old Scottish teenager. She had her best friend. She was very popular. Her brother John was slightly older than her, and I think he saw her as his annoying little sister. But she had a wide circle of friends, and she had her best friend who was called Lynn, and they would do quite a lot together. Elaine had just recently got a job in a jewellery shop, and she was really happy that she had her own money in her pocket, you know, at the end of the week when she would get her wages. And this gave her, you know, a little bit more freedom to do things that she wanted to do. And she enjoyed a night out with her friends.
I met Elaine in secondary school, and she had moved close to where I lived, and we used to go to school together. We used to go on the school bus together and back home together, and we chatted just about whatever teenage girls talk about then. She was funny. She liked to make people laugh. Elaine was kind and sensitive. Everybody now even remembers her in such a fond way. Elaine had her parents and older brother John. I used to see Elaine's parents every day when I went into the house before we went to school together. They welcomed me, they were friendly.
At that time in the 80s, when we were under 18, there wasn't a great deal for teenagers to do. There were a couple of under 18s discos that we would go to. The Celtic Club has always been a popular place for people to go. They have a downstairs area which is just a bar area, and they have a function suite up the stairs where they would have disco nights. It's also a cheap place. Celtic Club is a cheap place to go, and lots of people use the Celtic Club to go for a drink before heading out elsewhere, or just stay there for the entire evening. I would say back in 1986 the Celtic Club was possibly more of a hotspot then than it is now. I would say it was possibly a busier place then. Very popular.
Like many of the teenagers in the town, Elaine would visit the supporters club with her friends.
So Elaine came here to the Celtic Supporters Club that evening in June, where she was looking forward to a fun night out with her friends as there was a disco on.
She had said to her parents that they were going dancing that night to the supporters club, and the last thing that her father ever said to her was, have a good time and be careful. So Elaine and Lynn had taken themselves off to this supporters club, and eyewitness accounts of the night say that the girls had a great time. They were dancing and chatting and having just basically having fun.
They spent the evening there, and as a lot of the kids did after the disco, they went to a local hamburger stall in Cathcart Square.
Mari Milne is a retired detective sergeant who worked for Police Scotland in the Greenock area for over 20 years.
Elaine had promised her dad that she'd be home by midnight. Her friend had persuaded her to stay out a little longer and stay at her home, and Elaine said no, she was going to go home because she promised her dad to be home by midnight. So Elaine and her friend parted company at Cathcart Square just before midnight, and Elaine walked home.
After Elaine said goodbye to her friend, she started to walk the short distance home. The Celtic Supporters Club wasn't particularly far away from Elaine's house. I think it was about a 15-minute walk. And it's believed that just yards from her house, Elaine was grabbed.
Elaine was then found the following morning having been strangled and murdered in a lane just 50 yards from the front door.
At around 7:30 a.m. on the 2nd of June 1986, the body of 16-year-old Elaine Doyle was discovered in a small lane off Ardgowan Street in Greenock, just metres from the home where she lived with her family.
Her parents assumed that she had perhaps stayed the night at her friend's house rather than come home quite late. At that point, they became aware of police activity in the lane just yards from their apartment building. And Elaine's mum actually notified one of the police officers that was standing outside that her daughter hadn't arrived home from a night out the previous night. And that's when they discovered that their daughter had been murdered. Her clothes were lying beside her, and she had been strangled with a ligature. The murder weapon was never found by police, so they don't know how he did it. But what we do know is that Elaine was approached from behind and strangled very quickly, and there was no sign of any sexual assault. So the motive for Elaine's murder has never been revealed and is still unclear to this day.
When Elaine's body was found, she was naked. She was lying in a lane, open to the elements. And at that time, all the police officers were there were men. My understanding is that the divisional commander, the chief superintendent, came down to Ardgowan Street where Elaine was. And because there was houses overlooking, tenement flats overlooking the locus, he had suggested that a blanket from one of the police cars, of which we kept in the back of the police cars at that time, was put over Elaine's body to protect her dignity. And it was done with the best of intentions, and it was done without necessarily thinking of maybe any consequences thereafter, but it was to protect Elaine, to protect her dignity.
As police launched the hunt for Elaine's killer, forensic officers began securing vital evidence from the scene.
So Elaine's outfit on the night she went to the disco was she was wearing a leather jacket, a black top, a skirt, and when her body was found, there was a clump of hair lying next to her body. So it's assumed that the killer has grabbed her by the hair from behind, and he's actually grabbed her with such force that it's actually ripped a clump of her hair out. Aileen was also wearing a bracelet, and that was discovered at the scene as well, which had also been ripped off. The police were never quite sure how Aileen's killer approached her. You know, they could have been speaking in the street. He might have just pounced on her in the lane.
In 1986, forensic science was just beginning to be used across the board at crime scenes. At that time, it was hairs and fibres that were looked at to try and compare to anyone that we may have got as a suspect.
My name is Shirley Marshall. I'm a retired forensic biologist. So back in 1986, there certainly weren't the same guidelines and standards that are present today, because we've learned an awful lot over the years. However, there was still very good best practice going on and sharing of good techniques. In the most serious of cases, you would find a forensic scientist at the crime scene alongside the crime scene examiners, which would be there for advice to take the very best evidence. As far as I'm aware, back in the 1980s, gloves weren't necessarily used. However, some people would be using gloves, and certainly at crime scenes we would expect any body surfaces to be taped to recover any fibres and any evidence, physical evidence at the crime scene before a body was moved to the mortuary. Anybody approaching that scene had to be very, very careful. It would have been cordoned off. The body may have been protected, particularly depending on the weather, whether it was raining. There may have been like a tent put over the body. From what I can gather, the tapings were taken of her body in situ at the crime scene. Aileen was found naked, and apart from her bra, which was attached to one of her arms, and therefore it's really important to be able to examine that body in situ, where it is, before anything else disturbs it or it's moved in any way. The potential evidence that could be collected there would be hairs, fibres, even tiny bits of glass or paint, or physical traces, even things like botany, bits of plants, anything that could either have been left behind by the perpetrator or is important for the actual situation of the body.
In 1986, the tapings taken from Elaine's body were purely used to extract physical trace evidence in the hope of linking a potential suspect to the scene. Finding a suspect, though, would prove challenging for the police, much to the alarm of the local community.
Elaine's murder came as a complete shock because we had never known this. An innocent girl on her way home murdered. It was just unheard of. I remember being in my house, and I think it was my mum that told me, and I remember just going into my bedroom and looking out the window in complete disbelief, shock that this had happened to her. When people die or are murdered, you know, people say they were such a kind person, and Elaine was a kind soul who would never have harmed anyone, and for her to have met that end, it was just horrific, and it stunned the town. It stunned us as a year group. And I think it was just utter shock. I don't think I cried. I just stared My bedroom window sort of looked up to where Elaine's house was, and we just couldn't believe it. I often think she was so close, and I think in many ways it's worse because she was literally steps from her home, where she would have been safe, where she should have been safe. And I have often wondered, did he know that was where she lived? Because it seemed incredibly cruel to have murdered her at the door to her house, just beside her parents where they were sleeping. After Elaine's murder, we wouldn't walk home alone. And our parents also, it was a worry for them. And we would be told, do not walk home alone. We can come and pick you up if you need a lift, but do not walk home alone. So we didn't.
I think it's a horrific thing to happen to anyone. However, the district of Inverclyde in Greenock, especially where Elaine was born and bred, this was a highly unusual thing to happen. The streets were very safe to walk for anyone in 1986, and it was a real blow to the town. Everyone knew where they were on the night that Elaine died, and a lot of people had a connection to her family or friends, or certainly knew where she had been, and it was a real connection with the whole of the district of Inverclyde. It was almost a bit like a John F. Kennedy moment. Where were you the night that Elaine Doyle was murdered?
With fear gripping Greenock, a huge murder inquiry was launched in a bid to catch Elaine's killer quickly.
I think it was also crucial for the police to find the killer. I think the way investigations were carried out in 1986 and the way they were carried out now are hugely different. Back in 1986, it was really difficult for detectives and police officers across the board to identify people without witness statements or hard evidence, and the volume of information that came into the inquiry was so vast that it was very difficult to process everything.
Without CCTV coverage and mobile phones, police were relying purely on witnesses to come forward with information. And with the people of Greenock eager to help, there were multiple time-consuming lines of inquiry to be followed.
I think as the weeks passed and the killer hadn't been caught, and everyone in the town was convinced that this was a local person that had killed Elaine, so there was fear that the police didn't seem to have any leads, and was this killer going to strike again?
In June 1986, the town of Greenock in Scotland was reeling following the murder of 16-year-old Elaine Doyle just metres from her home.
About a week after Elaine's body was discovered, children playing outside the local library in Greenock discovered a burning bag. And it later transpired that this was actually Elaine's handbag.
The hope for police was that the bag might hold further evidence that could be linked to a potential suspect.
It's very difficult to know what transpired with Elaine's handbag, whether her killer took it and dumped it after the murder in panic, or if he kept it until he thought that the shock of Elaine's murder had died down slightly and perhaps set fire to it in panic. There wasn't a lot of forensic awareness back in the 80s, so that most likely wasn't a consideration. It might have been the case that the killer has dumped it and somebody else has found it, and then when they've realised it was Elaine Doyle's handbag, they've set fire to it. I don't think we'll ever know really what happened with the handbag.
A combination of the bag having been burnt and the limited forensic capabilities meant this promising lead came to nothing, and the detectives were back to square one. Despite carrying out over 2,000 house-to-house inquiries, no real suspects emerged. So reluctantly, the investigation was scaled down. Almost 2 decades after Elaine's murder, Police Scotland began to review the evidence once more.
In a case where there is lack of forensic evidence that's identified at the time, then for unsolved cases in particular, we would be also always looking back to see how has technology changed, what can we do now that we couldn't do then? And therefore, it's really important that we review cases.
In the case of Elaine Doyle, this involved reviewing the tapings that had been taken from her body back in 1986.
I think firstly it's really brilliant that the tapes were taken in the first place at that time. And secondly, that they were preserved. Now, an unsolved murder case is never closed. So we would never get rid of that evidence. Any samples that we take at the crime scene, any samples that we make in the lab, whether it be microscope slides, they are preserved, and they're preserved until that case is solved. Back then, and certainly when I did my training, we used just lengths of sticky tape. Effectively, you have that on a roll, you pull out a length, depending on the plastic surface that you're going to put it onto, you then cut an appropriate length of that tape, which would then be laid onto the surface, and effectively you would rub along, making contact with the surface, and then it would be what we would call potentially one-to-one tapings, that you would just put one and then put it straight onto the plastic. And that's how it's preserved, because the sticky side is then directly onto a plastic sheet, which we can then look at down a microscope to see what is there and what we might be interested in, and actually pick things off like hairs or fibres.
As well as fibres, police were also hoping to obtain vital DNA evidence that might have been captured during the initial forensic tapings.
When it comes to DNA profiling of sticky tape, we would actually just cut little pieces out of the tape and put that into a tube to extract the DNA from.
When I joined the inquiry in 2008, we had a full DNA profile. At that point in time, it didn't match anyone in the police database throughout Britain and Europe. Therefore, we had to then go back to basics and eliminate as many other people as we could.
Mari and the cold case team now had the mammoth task of scouring the original case files.
I thought I was only there for 6 months, and then I would go back to everyday detective work. However, very quickly, when I read all the information and all the things that had happened before and all the inquiries that had been made, it was very easy to be 100% invested into the inquiry. So when I get told after 6 months I was staying on the inquiry, it was really exciting to know going forward, one of these days we might get a result. We looked to see what inquiries had already been made and what we could do to progress the DNA sample that we had, and different avenues of where we were going to go to try and eliminate the people who had previously been involved in the inquiry, and we could eliminate them 100% by getting voluntary DNA from them.
Working alongside Mari was Chris Nisbet, who at the time was a detective constable.
The mass testing of DNA, we probably tested beyond 2,000 people. These tests would be for people who still stayed in Greenock. There was people that moved to Canada, there's people that moved in Australia, and it would be tiered of people that we knew were definitely out that night people who could have been out that night, or there would also be familial DNA of people who had since died that we had to then try and test their familial DNA. We were relentless in that we were confident that in there was such an important part of evidence that it was proportionate to travel across the world to find the person who had killed Elaine.
The reach of the inquiry was global, but having tested over 700 people across a 4-year period, police still hadn't found a match. In order to identify more individuals to test, they had to delve even deeper into the paperwork from the original investigation.
We had identified people who we felt were more likely to be involved in the inquiry, and because the volume of information had been taken by the initial detectives back in 1986, we basically had to start from scratch and eliminate everyone who had ever been mentioned in the inquiry.
One name that stood out to cold case detectives was John Doherty.
He was basically one of a number of people who we had identified whose names were in our system but hadn't actually been spoken to.
John Doherty had been out that night, and because the town was really busy at that point, and it had been a public holiday weekend, so the town was jumping that night. There was lots of people out enjoying themselves. But the only reason he was in the inquiry because one of his friends had been spoken to as part of the inquiry, who said, I was out with John Doherty, and for some reason they would never pursued that to go and see John Doherty, but not because they've made a mistake, because the inquiry was so huge, and there was lots of other names that the inquiry then never went on to see.
Not only had John Doherty never been spoken to, but witnesses placed him at the Greenock Celtic Supporters Club on the night Elaine had been murdered.
So John Doherty was part of the long list of people that we were going to gather DNA for. And that day they had a list. John Doherty happened to be one of that list. They went to his house in Ann Street where he'd stayed in 1986, and that was the address they had for them. And when they got there, he wasn't in, but his sister was in, and his sister told him he now stays at Trafalgar Street, and sent him to his new house in a different part of Greenock. So they went there directly instead of phoning ahead to say we're coming for this reason. They attended at his house completely unannounced, and they let them in without question. They explained to them why they were there, and they provided DNA. And I remember both of them have told me that they've walked out the house and thought nothing of it, but it was very similar to every other person that they captured DNA from. And then from there, they would have batched that with 10 to 20 more that they would gather over a couple of weeks.
So one of the duties that I had on the inquiry was I collated the DNA samples, and every week I would send them to the lab in Dundee, and within 6 or 7 days I would get an email back from the scientist there who basically told us that these people were not involved and we could eliminate them from Elaine's inquiry. It's a moment in my life that I will never ever forget when I switched on my computer that morning and opened my email and saw kind of red exclamation marks on an email from the lab in Dundee to say it was a person to scene hit, which was confirmation that the DNA that we had matched with a person who we'd taken DNA from. It's difficult to describe my emotions that day because it's one of these things where we always thought, would we ever find the person?
The DNA match belonged to John Doherty.
It was a phenomenal euphoria of we've done it, and knowing that it'd been very personal to me for such a long time because, as I say, my closeness in age to Elaine, I was family liaison to her mum and her brother, and knowing that at some point in time in the not too distant future I could go and tell them that we had identified the person that had killed Elaine.
As part of the investigation into the 1986 murder of Elaine Doyle in Greenock, mass DNA testing by cold case detectives had finally identified a clear suspect in the case. His name was John Doherty.
So in 2012, John Docherty was now living in Greenock. He'd returned in 1986. He left to go and join the army, and then returned to Greenock a number of years later. And in that time, he became a bus driver or a number of other jobs in the town. I think what really surprised the inquiry team is his limited interaction with the police, or any reports for any other violent crimes or anything like that over the years, that he didn't appear on our systems much in any way at all, which is a surprise for somebody who thinks committed such a horrible crime. You might expect him to appear, but no, he then returned to Greenock and started a very normal life with a new partner, and then went on to have a young family.
26 years on from the murder of Elaine Doyle, the now prime suspect, John Docherty, was living less than a mile from where she was murdered.
With the knowledge that we had and the DNA evidence we had, there's a high degree of confidence that this is the person, but we're testing that evidence, and you continually work at it to say, right, maybe if it's not, maybe, don't overlook, keep an open mind and looking at everything else.
Although John Docherty's DNA placed him at the scene of Elaine Doyle's murder, police wanted to gather more evidence to support the case against him.
We got the confirmation of the DNA match in May 2012. At that point in time, we basically had to work backwards in the inquiry. We had to then fill in the jigsaw pieces about what happened back in 1986, where John Docherty was, where he lived, who he lived with, what he was doing on that night, and a bit of a lifestyle interpretation of where he had been in all those years since 1986 to the current day. And that was really difficult because we had to do that under wraps. We couldn't let anyone know that we knew it was John Docherty. All our information was kept very secret. We worked in a specific part of the building where no one was allowed anywhere near any of our offices, and that was really difficult. People kind of had an idea in the police, but they didn't know who it was that we were looking at. The other evidence that we had against John Docherty was on the evening that Elaine was murdered, there was a witness walking on Argowan Street, and he saw what he believed to be Elaine and a man following Elaine. He gave a description of the man at the time, and a lot of inquiry was centred round about this individual. When we identified John Docherty, we were able to get a picture of him from 1986, and the witness was then shown that picture along with 11 others, and he was able to identify John Docherty as the person who he saw that night on Argowan Street. So that was crucial, again, 26 years later, to have someone who'd say, that's the man I saw.
Finally, in 2013, the police were ready to make an arrest.
A big moment for the inquiry team. I remember we were spoken to by the SIO that morning about the impact it was going to have in John Docherty, the impact it was going to have on his family. But we had to remember the impact that it had on Elaine's family for 26 years. Going to the house, again, you went through this in your mind a lot about how you're going to do it, how you're going to speak to the people that are in the house. Very conscious that he's got a wife and a young child in the house when you're going there. Very conscious of his neighbours and the impact, and for them to know, again, it's an infamous murder. But to be honest, it went pretty straightforward, and we quickly separated John from his family, took him into the living room, and while they were in the bedroom, again, there was a number of officers controlling that, and I was leading the rest. That had been part of the plan. And he was detained under the legislation that we had at that time that would allow us to interview him. And he was told, as part of the wording for that it was in relation to the murder of Elaine Doyle. And so I was waiting for any reaction, and he didn't say a single word.
What do you know about the murder of Elaine Doyle?
Nothing. Nothing other than what I've read.
Tell me what you've read.
Local newspapers, young girl, night out, murdered on the way home.
He didn't say very much at all in the interview. Certainly didn't give away any specialist knowledge or reasoning behind what happened. He said that he was unaware of what happened. He was aware of what happened because he'd seen it in the newspaper or in the news in general, but didn't have anything to add to it. I think a lot of that, in my experience, tells you about the person. It tells you that he knew exactly what was happening. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew exactly that he was about to be charged with Elaine's murder, and that his life and that of the people he loved and round about him was turned upside down as it had done in 1986 for the Doyle family.
Despite his denials, John Docherty was formally charged with the murder of Elaine Doyle.
The task that I was given on that morning was to go to see Maureen and John Doyle, Elaine's brother, and explain to them that we had detained someone. There was a whole lot of information I wasn't allowed to tell them at that point in time, but to be honest, they didn't want to know anything else. All they wanted to know was that we had detained someone. She was so grateful. She was obviously very emotional. We were both very emotional, and John, well, he was emotional also, but I think it was just knowing that it was giving them some good news. For once in their life, they had good news, and it was the news they'd waited a long, long time for. Phenomenal. It was very emotional. Jack and Maureen were desperate to find who had done this to Elaine. They both still stayed locally. Jack was in Greenock Town Centre every day talking to lots of people. Lots and lots of people knew him, and he often spoke quite sadly about, did he ever speak to the person who killed Elaine? Did they know who he was? And he said hello to them, and they engaged with him. That was a bit of a bugbear for Jack, understandably. And I just so wish that he was still here to be able to have told him that news.
Having refused to confess to Elaine Doyle's murder, John Docherty faced a trial at Edinburgh High Court, with his defence team focused on trying to discredit the forensic evidence. Key to the defence's argument was the blanket that had been used to cover the body of Elaine Doyle way back in 1986.
One of the main questions was that there was a blanket placed over Elaine at the crime scene, with best intentions, placed there for her dignity, but without a doubt compromised the crime scene in a certain way.
John Docherty's defence team's argument centred around the idea that the blanket placed on Elaine's body would have contaminated the crime scene, making the DNA sample unreliable. Police had the daunting task of trying to prove that wasn't possible by tracing the journey the blanket took to the crime scene.
We went to the laundry company that serviced the police at that time. So what we wanted to understand is, right, what was your washing practices like in 1986 compared to what they were in 2012, and being able to go down through that. It so happened that it was still the same laundry service. They'd grown and moved and changed their practices, but the way they washed blankets hadn't changed a lot. Destruction of body fluids and DNA from a blanket was as highly likely in 1986 as what it was in 2012, so that you would have a nice clean blanket and you wouldn't have the DNA or body fluids from the person that had it previously. So we satisfied ourselves of that.
Chris was able to prove that this particular blanket would have arrived at the scene washed and therefore clean of any trace DNA that could have contaminated the scene. This information completely discredited the defence team's argument.
The trial was a very, very difficult time for me personally. I had been on the inquiry for such a long time. I was not going to be called as a witness. However, I also was still there for Maureen Doyle as a family liaison officer. John, Elaine's brother, was at the trial every single day through in Edinburgh, which was a really difficult thing for him to sit through and listen to what had happened to his sister and the inquiries over the years, but also to be in such close proximity to John Docherty. He sat beside him every single day. So the trial was a really nerve-wracking thing because you never know what's going to happen.
Following a trial that lasted 52 days, on the 17th of June 2014, John Docherty was finally about to learn his fate.
His lordship read out that it was a guilty conviction. In fact, my colleague took a hold of my hand because I let out a yelp, which wasn't very professional at the time. However, it was a memorable moment for many reasons, and the satisfaction, you never know if a jury are going to give you the result that you're hoping for, but it was so satisfying. And then spending some time with John, Elaine's brother, directly after the verdict had come through was great. And then John couldn't wait to go and phone his mum, which was the most important thing in the world. John had to tell his mum that information. You pray that it's going to be an outcome that the family deserve and Elaine deserved, but you just never know if you've done enough. But we did enough.
28 years after the crime had been committed, Doherty was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Elaine Doyle, with a minimum tariff of 21 years.
John Doherty was given a life sentence at the High Court in Glasgow for the killing of the 16-year-old who was found dead yards from her home almost 3 decades ago.
I don't think Elaine Doyle's killer would ever have been found without DNA and science. I'm only just thankful that we did have that progression in the scientific world with the help of the biologists and the chemists and all the other very talented scientists that helped us get that result as well.
An unsolved murder from 1986, to find out that there's a new line of inquiry and that there's a DNA match is huge. That's huge for any detective at any level across the inquiry that they think they're going to have the opportunity to work on something like that. And again, the determination for a family that's had to wait that long for an answer, or wait that long for justice, yeah, that's a big responsibility and a real privilege to be able to do that.
Scotland has always been at the forefront of DNA technology, and we've always been one step ahead in terms of adopting and embracing the DNA technology and what it can actually do. In terms of the Elaine Doyle's murder, DNA was absolutely crucial in solving it, and without the advancement in DNA technology, then this murder would never have been solved.
This was the most satisfying inquiry I've ever worked on. I took my investigative skills back to the basics, and we spoke to people, we chatted, we gained their confidence, we got their information, they gave us their DNA. We did the investigation as it should have been done, and we got a conviction. And that's all that matters, that we found, identified and convicted the man who murdered Elaine Doyle. And that was the goal from the very beginning, and we took us a while, but we got that goal in the end.
My sort of core group of friends that I've been friends with since we were 11, we've often spoke about Elaine. She still crops up in conversation. Despite the years, the decades that have passed, she's still very much remembered. I think I miss what Elaine could have became. I miss the woman that Elaine would have grown up to be. And I'm sure she would have had a lot to give to society.